Hi, this is Block 3, Progressives in Power, Section 2, Who are the Progressives, with the section beginning with Muckrakers. Muckrakers is a term with much to do with progressivism in the early 20th century. When you hear the word muckraker, it is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. The name was coined by none other than Teddy Roosevelt. He liked these muckrakers. He was a big fan. Muckrakers were journalists, novelists, writers who searched for and then wrote articles and books about acts, or what they saw as acts of corruption in public officials, in government, and in business. They went around raking through the muck, raking through the mud until they found something juicy. And they would say, aha! Look at this. Look at this corruption. Look at this terrible condition. And they would publish them in the popular press, in the yellow newspapers, like we talked about in the last block. And people would buy them and say, oh my God, can you believe this? Some of them wrote novels using fiction to make their points, and some of them wrote newspaper and magazine articles using nonfiction to make their points. What we're going to go through now is a long list of muckrakers and their works. Again, this is the same sort of things as with the progressive reformers. I go through them to make a point that you should know that there were A, lots of them, and B, who a few of them specifically were, so you can cite them when you write. One of the first novels was a novel by Edward Bellamy called Looking Backwards. And in Bellamy's book, he predicts that the United States would become a socialist state in which the government owned and oversaw all the means of production, and it used this production to create justice and equality, and that moral law, religious law, would rule over everybody happily. It's a utopian novel, a novel about a perfect society. How do you get to this perfect society? Well, of course, you have to listen to the progressives and the technocrats and do as they say. And it was a very popular book, read by a lot of people who thought he had a lot of good things to say. Henry George wrote a book called, and here's Henry George, wrote a book called Progress and Poverty. Henry George said, progress itself creates poverty. That all of the economic progress that had been going on created poverty in and of itself. He believed in equality, Henry George did, so he was also a socialist, and he fought for reforms that said, take money from rich people and distribute it to the poor to create equality. Because the very progress that these industrialists and businessmen stood for, the very progress that they brought about created the poverty. Another book was by Henry Demarest Lloyd, who wrote a book called Wealth Against Commonwealth. You kind of get a sense for all these different titles. He became famous by exposing illegal business practices in the United States. He believed that corporations put the interests of themselves and their shareholders above the interests of workers and the American people as a whole. Wealth Against Commonwealth is a novel that presents this point of view through fiction. Thorstein Veblen, he's one you might want to specifically remember. His book became very famous. Thorstein Veblen. There he is. Thorstein Veblen wrote a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class. And Thorstein Veblen believed that society was definitely always evolving. But he took the belief of social Darwinism and kind of turned it on its head. Social Darwinists believed that the rich became rich because they were better, smarter, harder working than everybody else. Veblen says, no, 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 no. The rich become rich because they're parasites. They're sucking the blood. They're sucking the money out of the poor, the workers, and they have only risen to the top because they're parasites, and they are sucking the economic lifeblood out of everybody else. He thought that the wealthiest members of society were not the fittest, that they were simply the best cheaters, They were simply the best liars. They were simply the best at taking what was somebody else's and claiming it for their own. That's Thorstein Veblen. He's a very famous one, very important one also. As is Jacob Reese. And Jacob Reese was a photographer, actually. Jacob Reese, and one of your assignments for this block is based on Jacob Reese. Jacob Reese exposed social and political evils that he found taking pictures in his novel, How the Other Half Lives. Lincoln Steffens is another novelist. His novel concerned poor living conditions in American cities. Frank Norris wrote a book called The Octopus. And he said, and this is kind of best illustrated by a image here. See if I can find one that kind of... Yeah, here's a perfect one. Look at this. If you can see that, kind of zoom that in right there. Frank Norris wrote a book saying that this octopus, with its many arms in many different places, controlled the world of a group. He wrote a novel, controlled the world of a group of California farmers. And his point was that these large companies, these large corporations, these trusts were taking advantage of people and controlling them, and they were not allowing people to live free and independent lives. That was The Octopus by Frank Norris. Another one is Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell writes a book called History of the Standard Oil Company, John D. Rockefeller's company. And her book exposes the monopolistic practices of that particular trust. Tarbell's book strengthened the growing movement to outlaw monopoly and to outlaw the power of these trusts. John Spargo is another one, The Bitter Cry of the Children. The Bitter Cry of the Children is a novel decrying and being against child labor. The novel goes on to stress that children do not need to be working in factories. They need to be better educated with better schools and better teachers. It's another muckraker novel that people are reading throughout the early 20th century. Another one is David Grand Phillips, The Treason of the Senate. And in Phillips's book, The Treason of the Senate, he says that the senators, instead of being independent-minded statesmen who are doing what's best for the entire country, he argues that all of the senators are in the pockets of the trusts, and the senators only do what the monopolists and the trusts and big business wants them to do. And when the call came to change the way senators were elected by the state legislators to the people, Phillips's book, The Treason of the Senate, played a large role in that. These are the most famous. There's hundreds more. And anyone who is interested could pick up for a very small amount of money one of these muckraker novels and work themselves up into this righteous anger that something had to be done to change society, to improve society. Something had to be done to make American society better.